Welcome everyone to YouTube Masterclass Film Criticism 405. Dr. Sheley. I got my PhD from California Institute of the Arts, which means I have more than one PhD because that one's an honorary academic, strictly only and rarely given out. So that I was picked from the top of film schools like University of Southern California and American Film Institute. Harvard, as we know, which we will talk about briefly, is letting you have COURSERA units taken for this class, specifically through their school, but we must remind everyone that Harvard's never really had a film school. USC is clearly the #1 film school, and so to make me a professor of COURSERA through them was their decision, and they said yes, along with CALARTS, which we're saying is suddenly harder than Harvard because now CalArts requires you to get multiple PhDs, but Harvard doesn't necessarily imply that necessarily, but that's the only way I was able to get it and learn some quantum theory. Now, this isn't the master class on quantum theory or mathematics, but I will tell you my quick version of quantum theory, and we'll see if this is okay. It's like, basically, you take a logarithm, which is the number 0 is greater than, and then you put the letter infinity is greater than 1. Or it can go back the other way, less than, greater than. But then you'd have to flip the 1 to the 0. But we're looking at a scale from 0 to 1. And now, if you look at a scale from numeral 0, which doesn't exist, so you can't really use that even as a boundary that way because 0 doesn't exist, all the way to 1, which is suddenly a whole number, a rational number, 100%, we realize that if we divide any number with the 1, we can get a number that comes between 0 and 1, right? And we know that if we divide those numbers that we got from dividing 1, say by like 10 and get a 10th, which would be 0.1, which is between 0 and 10. But if we were to divide out a 10 from the 0.1, yes, we get 1/100th, but we could have gotten that from dividing it by 1/10 from the top, and now we're dividing between the divisions, and we can keep dividing, the theory goes, almost for eternity, that the number is so big that it's the number right before you get to eternity, before you hit it. Now, this is explained by Immanuel Kant in the 1700s Enlightenment era when quantum was invented, and it had a lot to do with the theory of evolution, with natural selection, with theory of relativity, and I've written sources material on these scientific topics. That film, this is semester 2 of film criticism, right? The film is based on a lot of theories that are materialist. That is, you have to have the film, to show it, to see it, to know it, that it's a text, that it's fallible only, that it's only as invincible as we can give it. We thought Hollywood was invincible, and then my friends and I were just talking about how scary it was during the pandemic recently that Hollywood had somehow disappeared and we'd never see it again, and then it would have these resounding comebacks, and then the writer's strike would happen, and then it'd be like everybody's wondering if it'll make it, and suddenly they're making it again. Hollywood's back in all its glory, and they're making movies again, and things are starting to come up, and we're thinking, well, we're the heroes that were making movies during the pandemic, but chances are a lot of those movies aren't going to be as good as some of the tradition of filmmaking style that has gone on even in the Hollywood classical era. And the Hollywood classical era is an important one to study, not just for its tutor code of homonyms and logarithms and whatever else, language logarithms they are. It's like setting an algorithm to find the pacing of the editing that's the least intrusive on excuse me, on the audience. Because if you were to be intrusive upon the audience and show them where the editing is coming and show them why the editing shows up, then it may be for a reason that you're a modernist and you're suggesting that your authorship of the movie is somehow more valuable than the authorship of the characters or the screenwriter, or the authorship of the screenwriter only feeds the authorship of the director, and that the authorship dilemma has come along since postmodern theory, and Roland Barthes is, of course, the famous postmodern theorist that said the author is dead. Now, if the author is really dead, then someone had to be the author in the first place to die, right? And maybe not. Maybe what he's saying is there is no such thing as an author, that everybody kind of works on the same grand narrative at the same time, and it all comes out the same way no matter what. But I have to think that there's a modern perspective, like this movie we're going to cover, Mean Streets by Martin Scorsese, who also has a master class, and his words are hung on a lot more authoritatively than mine, even at Harvard. So be careful when you're signing up for these master classes, because they're going to challenge you to see things in light of how they're seen by the book, and traditionally, and in the modern way. There's classical and there's modern, you know, and that realism sometimes is classical and that formalism is sometimes more modern is kind of true. And we'll talk about that gravitation, because with realism, you get a sense like it's what's naturally there, but we all know in Hollywood cinema, it's formalized that what's really there is going to be this flowery, beautiful aesthetic that fulfills your life, and you see everything through the eyes of a movie star and his girl. Now, Casablanca, I'm going to talk about before Mean Streets, but we'll talk about their similarities and differences. Now, Casablanca is 1942, before the war effort in World War II was extremely strong, but you got to admit, Warner Brothers is already, with being, you know, going back to the early days of the Nickelodeons and things we talked about semester one, which we'll talk about again, the early film toys, and then all the way to the early film days of watching movies in a theater, and Warner Brothers already having Nickelodeons, and then Warner Brothers being from, you know, Jewish and pointing out the Nazis in the 30s with their sound films, and being triumphant all through this silent era as a great studio. You know, it's really the greatest studio that still exists now. You know, we still have a Paramount, we still have an MGM, we definitely still have a Warner Brothers, though. It's the studio that you can't ignore, and that there's a Disney now kind of replaces RKO, and that you'd also have, of the other big five, Fox, and Fox is still around. So bless you for all these studios except RKO that stayed around, but Warner Brothers really stayed around. I mean, through it all, it's had the most studios go bankrupt on it that were sub-studios of its own outlet that it gleamed back onto and survived. That Disney makes more money is without argument, sure, but that they're in a kids market means that they're much more amped to make money, and the overhead cost is quite simply of building a car or building a computer is higher than building some of the accoutrements that the youngers can't live without. But that's not totally true, because kids are really expensive, and you've got to think, when you're having a nuclear family aesthetic and you're buying for your 3 kids, that it would be less expensive for 2, but if they all went off to college and you banked it all on them to make it back, well, they'd end up doing shows like this to pay off their college. And that's not the only reason I'm here. It's because to share with you, Casablanca is an interesting film. It's Michael Curtiz. Okay, come with me to the fact that this is Leonard Maltin, great critic. I named him as the Critic Guilder #1. Leonard Maltin says this is the best movie of all time. Well, it even says on the back, it says 4 stars, the best Hollywood movie of all time. And we all know Leonard Maltin loves Hollywood like massively more than he loves Bollywood. Like me, I love Bollywood a little bit. I think Bollywood's pretty cool. Music videos with Indians and stuff, yeah, we could do that. But Casablanca puts you in the Hollywood seat of all time, that it's forward action, Michael Curtiz action, adventure, hero, melodrama, romance, that Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart have the romance of a lifetime, that he's got a bar, or a joint as they like to call them, in the middle of Casablanca, way off in the boonies near the Middle East, but we're not talking right there near Shangri-La. You have Casablanca, this bar that's run by this guy Humphrey Bogart, who used to be a gun runner for the revolution back in the day, but now that World War II is going on, all the Americans are siding with America, and the Nazis are taking over everywhere. I mean, the Nazis are coming, and they've already infiltrated Morocco, where this Casablanca place is, and Humphrey Bogart's all sure he can trick the Nazis, get out with everything, and then who should show up but Ingrid Bergman, and so he makes his African-American companion, which rare in American transitional monumental films is there a character of an African-American, so we can already admit that we're probably going to have some stereotypical problems with him being the jazz artist in the film, but it does put a good light on that subject by making him the true jazz artist and not needing, he's like the savior of everybody with his jazz music. It's not the other way around that they just gave him a job and that's why he's okay. They're okay because he's playing. And without played against Sam, we wouldn't even have Casablanca, because he ends up downing. Humphrey Bogart sees her and he ends up drinking, and he isn't even really a total alcoholic, and he runs a bar. But then he has a flashback of when he's with Ingrid Bergman, and they're in Paris, of course, where else? And it's a Hollywood movie, so probably half of it's sets of Paris, half of it's fly-by-night character lead-ins. And they're in Paris, and they're like in love, and she thinks her man is dead because she hasn't seen him. And he thinks she's the greatest thing he's seen since the liberation, and he's going to leave the war effort for her. And they make out, and she just disappears. But we find out it's because she found out that her husband was still alive, and so now she's in love with these two guys, but never wants to see Humphrey Bogart, who is not Sam Spade in this, okay? Whoever was thinking that. That's Big Sleep. This is Casablanca. We'll talk about Big Sleep when we get there. It's this semester's ravishing finale of the Big Sleep. Like, I haven't talked enough about the wonderful fact that Howard Hawks and Michael Curtiz were two of the greats from the Hollywood classical era. And the Hollywood classical era, not to just name the big five studios, and Columbia and Universal and the other studios, it's just, they had this certain way of polishing and certain way of getting down to the fine intent tooth comb of like the props needed, and the outfits were all gorgeous, and the scenography, which is what I like to use about scenario, mixed with what's shot. It's the scenario of the script mixed with what's shot is the scenography of the film. That's why you could refer back to scripts for how the scenography is supposed to look as a director. And I know that's kind of an invented word, but I use it all the time in my film theories, which are, by the way, COURSERA textbooks, and they're really, I welcome you to read them. If you read the film theories course book, you can ace the final in this class. You can ace it because quoting the film theories books in my class is what I mostly do. That I haven't given credit to all of the critics that have helped me get here and helped me learn these kind of things. I will join a Hollywood classical moment of criticism here with Casablanca with none other than the great Laura Mulvey. Now, Laura Mulvey is a great critic, and she's ended up in some critical reference books all over the map with her critical cinema theory that there's a subject and object positioning with classical Hollywood cinema. Now let's see if this is true. It says that subject and object positioning, that the man is treated as subject, and this is kind of a Gone with the Wind looking Casablanca picture anyway, around the same area, but the man is seeming like the subject, and the woman is seeming like the object of his confession. Now I've heard this before in that movie, what was it, The Obscure Object of Desire by Louis Buñuel? Isn't that he was saying that, like, by switching the actress, but she's still the object, makes her the same sexual desire, although it could be more desires because it should be the discrete objects of my desire, okay, Buñuel, because there's two objects, two women, and neither one gets treated as the subject in any of your movies, so we all know that women are objects. You might as well just say they are in your title, right? Well, this is more classical. So we're just saying that because the film spectators are more predominantly male and youthful audience, they would want to see themselves from the angle of the male soldier in the bar that has the broken heart, that ends up fighting the war, does for the best intention, gives up the girl so she can go back to the war hero she thought was dead but was actually in an imprisoned camp, and they could be back together. It's the ultimate. He throws his fight so she can have hers, and then makes friends with Claude Rains, who is a wild and crazy Nazi until he realizes he's beaten, and then he's coming to the other side pleasantly. We'll see how that goes. In the sequel to Casablanca, which may have been made, but it's not Night in Casablanca with the Marx Brothers, which has an even more question of subject-object positioning as who is the subject if not the Marx Brothers, and why are they treated as objects by the shooting? It's something interesting about a Marx Brothers movie, that they're the subject, but that they're typically the object, if not the object being the other person, of course, including the POV shot, which is now objective, because if it's from Groucho's point of view, it's going to be jilted as heck as a point of view. Now that Bogey and Bacall and Ingrid Bergman, Bogey and Bacall, by the way, had 4 movies together. And these are not, the Casablanca is not one of their 4 movies. They had The Big Sleep, Dark Passage, To Have and to Have Not, and Key Largo. And those are the 4 Bogey and Bacall movies. And we'll talk about those. And Big Sleep, again, as Howard Hawks, it's a few years after Casablanca. Looks like it's 50 years after Casablanca. The Casablanca catches such a moment in time that it even looks even more classical than some of those early films like Morocco, is not because Michael Curtiz wasn't concerned with the nostalgia factor of having this kind of big exploitation of Western culture in Eastern culture, that America takes off in every country and the Nazi threats out to get it at first, but nothing can stand stronger than the human spirit, which is why when the French Liberation theme song is played, the Americans clap, but when the German side of things come in, well, these Warner Brothers aren't going to accept those anti-Semite Nazis now, are they? And Bogey's going to stand up for him every drink he has to get Ingrid Bergman off his mind. And the way it's cut together makes you think you're actually looking more through a man's point of view than a woman's, and that she has to be the objective, beautiful, dolled up in makeup, lighting just right, to be the object of affection. Makes it, when women watch most of these classical movies, they're going, so the chick, they really like the chick, and the Bogey, he looks good, but he keeps looking at her like she's what we want to look at, so you're being forced as a female, Laura Mulvey says, to look mostly at the girl, and so now you're like thinking, am I supposed to be a lesbian by watching these movies? Because I'm not feeling that way, but they're pushing me on to some woman as object goal. And of course, this could be viewed as sexist, is sexist to a feminist. To me, I can understand how actually in the Hollywood era, they were using techniques of German Expressionism, French Impressionism, that they didn't exactly have to answer to the morality of whether or not the girl was the dominant figure in the role, wasn't maybe in their first nature, but that Michael Curtiz had witnessed offhand what other relationships were like seeing the Trouble in Paradise relation, or seeing the, all the way to the power trio creations of some of their other films. And Paul Henreid is one of the main actors in this too, and he plays kind of the love triangle guy who gets captured and they think he's dead, and Ingrid Bergman goes to Bogey, and we'll always have Paris. By the way, the last thing I'm going to say about Casablanca, besides the fact that it's so transitional, erasure head, you can't see the transitions in this without counting them, and counting them all the way through would distract you how forward thrusting the sound and visual design are in this, as well as the script is all forward active. And Michael Curtiz, even more than Howard Hawks, is a forward active. He's writing about the end of the script in Act 1. He's getting us to where it will end in Act 2, and he's thrusting us to the end, closer to the end. By the middle, we think we've seen the whole thing. That's only because we were ready for the end in the first scene, and that doesn't mean we're not going to watch another hour of it, because this is beautiful. And what's amazing about this film is how enduring it is, because even if you've never seen the film or heard it, you've definitely probably run across some of its pop cultural references. And Play It Again, Sam, is one of the things you hear from it. You hear these sound bites from Casablanca that make it, by far, the most quoted, maybe most quotable. Quoted in the sense that everybody's said at least a line off of it, from the Hill of Bean to This is the Beginning of a Beautiful Friendship. to play it again, Sam. We've all had those lines thrown at us. There's a lot of other ones in Casablanca. But quotable, meaning that more so than Princess Bride do we refer to its antics as a script, as great lines of dialogue. And I think we do that with Spaceballs too much, because really it's not as good of a movie as Princess Bride and Casablanca, but that there's very few movies quoted more than that is kind of what we're looking at. And I'm not just trying to give Mel Brooks a break on Spaceballs, because if we were to cover it at all in this class, we wouldn't really. We would say it's a classical Hollywood kind of mishmash of genres, that it's a poor type of, what's that called? Not pastiche, but parody. See, parody is supposed to be humor. And parody is when you take an idea and you make fun of it. So instead of Casablanca, we have a parody called Night in Casablanca, which is a Marx Brothers movie and a pretty high-class parody. It's more of a good movie than some of the parodies of today, especially that are still trying to parody Casablanca or something, because with a parody, you kind of got to be time-specific, and that's why they don't really work, because they're kind of pop culture mix-ups that make you think you're cool for knowing the pop culture mix-up with a little bit of a lollipop thrown on. You're still kind of laughing a little bit about it. Casablanca has its funny parts, but it's an emotionally human way. That the modern event is watching Humphrey Bogart drink it out. Several scenes of this is cool. That the love romance story in the greatest Hollywood film ends up flopping and they don't have a Hollywood love is great. That its box office goes on for all eternity and that it continues to be one that people are constantly looking for, not just because they've given it away as a gift or because they sold it for money, and I've sold things for money to get Casablanca. So I highly recommend you want to look at the most beautiful way of making a movie. Just look at Michael Curtiz, and this is already like his 50th film. From when the silent era was going on, he was even making like Noah's Ark, this modernized silent movie based on Noah's Ark, but it was like this building, like not Atlas Shrugged, but Fountainhead style. I mean, who saw Noah's Ark by Michael Curtiz, and then to graduate as Michael Curtiz through all these levels and come to finally rest with Casablanca and now have it be the most defined Hollywood film, and he's like Hungarian, but that his cast and crew is red-blooded American, and so is Michael Curtiz. That Martin Scorsese, teacher of another Martin, you know who he is, the greatest director, said he remembered in his special, a trip to the American movies or whatever, his special, his 5-parter. He said that there was a movie by Michael Curtiz called Charge of the Light Brigade, which I've seen on TCM, and it's like not a Western, but a Civil War kind of movie, but like a period piece, and not definable totally by its story or its characters, but not just as a history lesson, but you're kind of like movie. And that's Michael Curtiz in the 50s, almost the 60s, maybe even further, maybe further back, but it's 42. Michael Curtiz is already branded as one of the Hollywood classical cinema greats. That he defines Hollywood classical cinema is no doubt going back to his roots in the silent era. Although he wasn't the most well-known silent director, he still had enough clout to get his kind of movie his way. One last thing about Casablanca, film noir. Think film noir. This is the Hollywood version of the film noir film. That the lighting's a little canted, that the viewpoints are a little canted, not like Ingrid Bergman with that notorious shot in Hitchcock's film where the scene goes all the way 360 upside down and then she sees Cary Grant standing right side up all of a sudden. It's not quite there with its POVs that are coming straight from film noir when Hitchcock is using that notorious. He's going detour, here we go, you know, shaky cam on Kiss Me Deadly from the 50s, here we go. You know, it's like, these are like remodelings of ways that people get these subjective viewpoints that were originally suggested perhaps in German Expressionism. And that's where I ended with Laura Mulvey, was the German Expressionist thing. If you're copying a style to kind of emanate a style, yeah, you have to admit you're sexist, because it's a basically bonus for the phallogocentric or the male-centered organism that natural selection sometimes privileges men is sexist. That there are certain facts of life that are sexist doesn't mean cinema always has to be sexist. And we will get into some more feminist to the liking movies before this day of Masterclass expires. But I think that's going to put Casablanca to a limit. Oh, it says in the corner here that it was the winner of 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. You know, that's a rare case of a movie being up for Best Picture winning that really was Best Picture. And I'm going to get to the quote-unquote feminist film of this, right? After Mean Streets. We're going straight into Mean Streets, so hold on. Here we go, Martin Scorsese. The one thing you got to know about Martin Scorsese is I've written a lot about him, and a lot of people have written a lot about him because he's one of our greatest filmmakers. But that I have a little history with this film. Back in the 70s, it was originally released before I was born, right? Well, in the year 2010, I wrote a best-selling book that eventually went to the New York Times bestseller, and they were selling my book, and it was like this nonfiction film critical decathlon type thing, and it was going to make waves on Google forever, and it still is, you know, this big programming book on the history of film and other critical aspects and who all the critics are throughout time, and literary analysis and things I write about too now, but only in this big 1,000-pager, you know. That Martin Scorsese and his partner Martin Murdoch from this movie Mean Streets teamed up and sold copies of Mean Streets with my Webiverse or whatever was brilliant, because I thought, well, that's going to help me out. Being connected to a Martin Scorsese movie in any way, especially Mean Streets, my favorite one of his movies, it's going to really help me out. And he may not even know that he connected his script to be sold with mine because it was related material or something was related about the Catholicism, the catechism, the sins never being paid for, the sins overcoming, the transgressions worse than the forgiveness. You know, it's like, so Martin Scorsese was studying to be a priest when he went to NYU and decided instead to make film. Now, it's a good thing because that he wasn't a priest and a filmmaker, because we would have lost one of the Da Vinci's of a lifetime if he were to become a priest. That his priesthood would have been good and he would have been a fair priest is not to say that he wouldn't have been a good priest. It's just that, come on, when he got to NYU, he started seeing films by all these directors like Godard and Anger, and all these films were coming out. And it was the early days of the French New Wave, and so he made Look Who's Knocking at My Door, and that is like a Spike Lee film, She's Gotta Have It, which both of those films are the only two that I know of at NYU to become masterpieces released to the theater, although they released them while they were at that school as student films, had to make those films to graduate. And yet here we sit with 2 masterpieces on our door. Who's that knocking at my door? She's Gotta Have It. And those are, if Martin Scorsese were to ask the question, who's that knocking at my door, then Spike Lee would just answer, She's Gotta Have It, you know. But I bring you to Mean Streets, which is after Boxcar Bertha. And Martin Scorsese was worried, and he was discussing with his friend John Cassavetes, you know, from the Houseman Project. John Cassavetes, who was with Orson Welles some of the time on the Houseman, but this was later when he worked with them. And John Cassavetes confided in Martin Scorsese. He said, you know, your films would be really good if they were more like, you know, like a gangster film, you know, like you do really good gangster films. Like you should make a movie. So Martin Scorsese said, well, he did know of one gangster movie he thought of making for a low budget, and it's Mean Streets. And I'm telling you, this movie, Mean Streets, is like Reservoir Dogs meets Boondock Saints meets Clockwork Orange meets Fight Club, everybody's favorite gangster film rolled into one, buddy movie like The Outsiders rolled into one, discovering all the talent rolling into one, let's have a nightmare and let's enjoy every bit of it, gangster film. Scorsese, let's hear it for Mean Streets. And then the cover is Joseph Gilmas from Newsday. It says exquisite, savage, compassionate, and brilliant. And I just love how they have this gun in the picture of the DVD version. And that these movies, Casablanca and Mean Streets, they're perennial favorites. You could sometimes find them even at Target. And that, like, they're such shocking movies, even for today's standard. It's true that there's more nudity and violence in Mean Streets than they can have in the average R-rated movie even now, is a testament to how Scorsese did have control, even at the beginning of his career, to get his films screened the way they were. That De Niro had been in a couple of Brian De Palma films for Troma, as kind of a side note here, because the De Niro had been in Greetings and Hi Mom, and there's one other one. I'm having trouble, it's like remembering it, but Greetings and Hi Mom and Happy Halloween or something, and there are all these Troma movies when Brian De Palma was working for Troma, but he didn't have much of a budget. Now, I work for Troma, okay? I'm one of the only USC grads to have kept my Troma job there. Even when I was homeless in LA, they chalked me up as working for Troma, which saved some of my college points later, and I don't really talk about those days because that was a whole other lifestyle, and I was busy trying to figure out philosophy on the road, and it got me to figure out philosophy on the road. But that Troma has had a huge induction to the series of cinema without even naming claims to some of the directors that work for them now. Let's just not forget that De Niro and Brian De Palma were pretty much at Troma during the beginning days of the 80s, making these movies, getting them ready. I mean, in the 70s, in 75, about with Hi Mom and Greetings. And then they did one later, and it was still De Niro. And that the reason I bring them up is because they're the predecessors to Mean Streets. They're like the films about how to make films about how to make films. The Mean Streets is more about films about films about films. Comes really true in Taxi Driver, which is like part of the same universe as Mean Streets and Raging Bull and Goodfellas and Casino and Gangs of New York, to name the real series that cuts through the Scorsese series of all his most daring films, and most of them having De Niro. That in Mean Streets, there is a scene with movies in it, but in Taxi Driver, there's a scene where Travis Bickle, De Niro's character as the taxi driver, very modern acting, method acting, social, political, be the person, be with the person, that he's in the theater watching The Searchers, and that he's in the theater watching The Fall of the House of Usher by Roger Corman, and The Searchers by John Ford, is Scorsese saying, see, I told you, all these movies is one big movie haven for where we all get to go to see The Searchers and The Fall of the House of Usher. Now, wouldn't we all live so happily in blank land forever after if all we had was The Searchers and The Fall of the House of Usher? I'd be okay for that. I'd be okay to say, hey, we all have The Searchers and Fall of House of Usher. One's Corman at his best, one's John Ford at his best. We can survive, or we can survive on Hollywood classical interpretations of action films, or action films as they're denoted into the new wave of gangster movies by the American New Wave New Cinema. And that American New Cinema comes barreling in with Martin Scorsese, and that even his newest movie, all the way to his newest movie, which I've seen almost all of them, except the Italian and the I haven't seen the Italian, which is a newer one, and Silence, which is a newer one, because I haven't been able to afford anything on Amazon Prime since I got my last stimulus check. No, I'm kidding. Don't pay that towards this class and you'll get all the credits you need. No, I'm kidding. So that we're saying that suddenly, like, movies are now these, like, life-saving forces, and that, like, his newest movie, The Killers of the Moon, and you know, the Flowers of the Killer Moon. Sorry, Flowers of the Killer Moon, or whatever. And it's like this new Killers of the Flower Moon. Killers of the Flower Moon is what I'm getting zoned in, and you'll have to give me a 5-second credit there because I was getting this new idea from Scorsese off my head that he's going to make a Jesus movie, and I don't really know whether that's about a good idea movie or not, but you'd have to watch the Gospel according to St. Matthew over and over and over, which you did for Last Temptation, and I don't really know if they can fly with another cinema verite Jesus mode. Jesus is supposed to have his own greatest show on earth, Copacabana behind him to get the job right these days. But anyway, I think Scorsese's interesting in Mean Streets more so than Greetings and Hi Mom, but those are really in the same reference of low-budget exploitation films, and that Mean Streets kind of takes the exploitation film version of Black Mama, and that's something that we missed with The Godfather, is that Bloody Mama, with, and Black Mama, White Mama too has these kind of moments that are later in these modernist gangster films, but Bloody Mama especially was one of those Roger Corman movies with Sheley Winters, and finally, a Sheley Winters movie where she doesn't get housed. She doesn't get doused. that she's the Don and the Don Corleone gonna base it on Bloody Mama later on is true. And you got to realize that Bloody Mama was not just the predecessor, but the film that everyone was trying to make bloodier, gorier, more insane, and more following a plot line like it than any other exploitation film. Now, I remember last semester we got into a discussion of Cage to Heat. And Cage to Heat was Jonathan Demme's servitude with Roger Corman, which we'll talk about some of that servitude that even led to Akira Kurosawa having Roger Corman produce one of his films in the later 70s, 60s era, when Roger Corman was so fundamental to the running of AIP, and we often forget that AIP, American Independent Productions, really was bigger than some of the small three pickups, Columbia, Universal, and the other pictures that were open. I'll have to come back to that because for one night I miss a point. I can't remember the big five. Let's talk about the big five. We got Warner, again, MGM, RKO, Fox, and Paramount. Not in that order because MGM was the greatest with its musicals. Paramount was the greatest with its sophisticated European or melodrama style. Then you got Warner Brothers with its gangster films and some of its backstage musicals. Then you got Fox with its westerns, and westerns kind of gravitated between all the studios until Warner Brothers with the sound era came so magnificently in, and that these big five studios were already established in the 20s and went on until the Paramount act of disvaluing all the studios came. And RKO was an experimental force where they played both early Disney cartoons, to say the least of why RKO is amazing. That they don't have RKO stock anymore doesn't mean it's not the most valuable. That they don't make it anymore commits that it's harder to get a hold of, and therefore RKO is a good stock to have, especially being connected with Disney, but not an active company anymore. Very interesting how that played out. But King Kong was made at RKO, and it went huge. So huge that they had enough money to spend the money on the one we all learned about the great sledding dilemma, Citizen Kane. Is a sled a boy's best friend? But now you fast forward from the Citizen Kane honor of making films, kind of film noir, and that film noir would lead to exploitation. You still have to take into consideration that these Mean Streets movies that were coming out in the 70s were the breaker of all rules, Godard style. We're going to have a jump cut where we want it. We're going to have fast motion where we accentuate it. We're going to have slow motion where we accentuate it. We're going to have devices of camera use. We're going to have props. We're going to have people fighting, choreographed. And that it's still a gangster film, but it's like a Godard movie where they're not only gangsters by necessity, that they don't really look at themselves. Even Bonnie and Clyde gangstery is only because they're gangsters by association in Mean Streets. An interesting thought, considering in Goodfellas, they're really gangsters. Casino, they're really gangsters. Gangs of New York, it's the beginning of all gangsterism. But Taxi Driver and Mean Streets have this certain gangsters by association pattern that only they have, but we wouldn't stop to say that they remain in that series I just named. But there's so many other Scorsese films like King of Comedy. There's so many other Scorsese films like Bringing Out the Dead at the end, towards the 90s, into the 90s, and there's Scorsese films we've all seen like Age of Innocence, and there's Scorsese films we've all come to love, like not just Goodfellas, but After Hours. I've seen it; it's great. All the ones we thought were like not necessary to see. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, necessary to see, and it was Alice That Doesn't Live Here Anymore was again one of Cassavetes' own points of view that Scorsese should stick to the meaty gangster film, and that Cassavetes had his hand in some of the gangster films that he wanted to do personally. At the end of his career, it comes through in The Killing of Chinese Bookie and Gloria, which The Killing of a Chinese Bookie only has really one aestheticized scene of violence with gangsterism, but Gloria is a full-fledged Cassavetes, I still love you, Scorsese, but I've got to do a Scorsese movie the way you would do it, even with my wife being the heroine of the story, and I don't mind that and all that. But that Cassavetes in that debate was probably most right in saying that Scorsese should go back to his hardcore hoodlum, like the Wild Bunch, not the Wild Bunch. It's the Wild Bunch in a way, but it's more like the Wild One with Marlon Brando on his bike. It's like he's coming into town for a day. He's got Rebel without a cause on his mind. Everything goes wrong. He's still having a good time. Everything goes wrong, or he still gets the girl, and everything goes flat out dead. And he leaves town with the girl that says, "Well, it was a cool town for 5 minutes, but then it got real seedy and killed us all." And that I'm not gonna name who he plays in this, but that Marty makes a director cameo in this film is totally true, as well as Taxi Driver, as well as some of his other films that we can't find him in as well. And I'm not sure if he was in that movie. Oh, what was it? We won't go there. It was like Swimming with Sharks. It wasn't Swimming with Sharks, but there was a movie about directing, and it came out in the 90s, and it's really irrelevant except for that Scorsese has been sneaky as a director, learning how to teach actors to act by sneaking in starring roles of his own. For instance, here's one I do know. In Akira Kurosawa, again, the Japanese director, came to America and made part of his movie Dreams, or actually probably flew Scorsese to Japan to play Vincent van Gogh in the movie Dreams, and that he's a really good Van Gogh. And it reminds me of Kirk Douglas, actually, in Lust for Life by Vincent Minnelli. It's totally true, and that those performances are really similar and really indicative on why it seems that Scorsese is like a director that needs to play every role in somebody else's movie as well as his own to become a better director. And I wouldn't even be surprised if he was a PA on somebody's big film just to see what it's like to be a PA, because this is that method directing. It's like social, real. If De Niro is going to put it all on the line and become a Taxi Driver, why can't Scorsese put it all on the line and capture the exact reality that he wants to capture for that Taxi Driver in a way that would be like you're riding with the Taxi Driver with a camera, and that's all you got is representation of the reality. And with these kind of films, Scorsese really worked his way into big budget, because I know Mean Streets was a small budget, and even with De Niro in it, De Niro was kind of an unheard of actor. That Mean Streets was the film that catapulted him into Godfather 2 is true. And that that Scorsese made Boxcar Bertha with Roger Corman. There's Roger Corman again. And Francis Ford Coppola had years earlier made Dementia 13, which kind of started the whole movement to be a Roger Corman, the future director of Hollywood, start out with Roger Corman. And Dementia 13 was really what gave Coppola his start. And that Coppola was secure in the start of Lucas, and Coppola was secure in the start of Spielberg. He was also secure in the start of Scorsese, and he had seen Mean Streets and had immediately become friends with Scorsese. And this is a year after Godfather, and some of these reference choices to characters like Harvey Keitel and stuff were like thinking they would do a Godfather movie, but it was a lower budget. Now, Godfather is a pretty low budget movie I don't really mention, because how they got some of those shots were from favors from people, and that they'd worked on it to get those shots and they didn't know they were going to is really true. And that like Godfather is an epic, but the Mean Streets has just as many crazy big budget scenes, like for instance where they get a real Bengal tiger to come onto the set and be in like a closed pen, and that they're in there, one of the actors is in there petting him. This is like somehow on the original Martin Murdoch script, only they'd worked it in on some improv sessions with the actors earlier, and they knew this was going to be the Scorsese movie to really pull them out. They even put this priest shaking Harvey Keitel's hand when it says directed by Martin Scorsese on this really flashy credit sequence. And I must mention something about the flashy credit sequences of directors. There is an art form that goes into title design for cinema. Title design for cinema, I don't talk about it a lot, but the covers are a lot like, have the title design and the font of how it's written. See how Mean Streets is written there? See how Casablanca is written there? It's the font for how the text is written in the titles, and it's how they make the movie poster out of it and everything. And the title design is based on the title. Like the title, Saul Bass, who was a title design artist for almost all the movies in the 50s for Hitchcock and all these other directors, and did the titles for Psycho, and that there's these great title sequence directors, you don't even know their names anymore, that do these really big James Bond title sequences, and the title sequences before movies were like part of the reason people would get down and boogie with the movie. Pulp Fiction is really one of the last contemporary films to use a title sequence to its full effect, because it has the music and the titles coming up to match the music like they always do, but then the word Pulp Fiction is being squeezed back like we haven't seen that before, but we have, but don't remember any film where we saw it, even though somewhere in the 70s blaxploitation, I'm sure they had tons of films like that, like Blackula probably even streaked forward while the names appeared on it. I wouldn't doubt it, or does now, or whatever. But that the title design to Mean Streets is one of those really clear home movie, like we cut together this student film home movie type hybrid. We've got it on the screen for just enough time to have the visuals flash in, and that Scorsese's showing us standing next at this festival, this Italian Roman Catholic festival, where they're kind of hanging out before they go off to become kind of gangsters by necessity. Because see, I don't really think that my book that I sold had much to do with Mean Streets, other than it was a movie and a book that were seen by thousands of people, that nobody knew a lot about it. They really liked it. They gave it a good review, and it was a bunch of mixed up different styles of all the things they liked about earlier films directed, kind of in this exploitation, Roger Corman kind of shell coming out of it. And now we've got the Bonnie and Clyde image in our head. We've got Scorsese's mom having a seizure in this film. We've got everything thrown in that cost them money to make, and all the jump arounds we need. We've got Scorsese's deadly cameo. Thank you, Mean Streets, for showing us that don't have much budget how to make a movie that looks like big budget. I mean, we could all try and make The Godfather and fail, but we could make a Godardian movie like this where it's a tenth of the budget that Scorsese used for Casino, but still as good as, if not better than Casino, because of the amazing script, the sentiment of Catholic guilt that lies in Scorsese's being, is that we know we're doing wrong, but we have to do wrong anyway to live, because it's the only way to live. And he says in the movie at the beginning, you don't pay for your sins in the church. You pay for your sins in the street, and everything else is just bullshit. Now, if we can please have a feminist moment, just one feminist moment, and I might even get to talk about another film tonight. But for now, I'm talking about Modesty Blaise. That's right, Joseph Losey. We all know and love him. No, we don't all know and love Joseph Losey. Now that I'm showing this film long before Spartacus is kind of my testament to why I like films where they decided on showing the blacklisted guys their name there, and it wasn't like Spartacus where everybody wanted the blacklister's name back on there, and they finally got it on there, but at what avail? Because see, the Spartacus credits are really wrong in a way, because the title design even is messed up, because it says Stanley Kubrick's director, but Stanley Kubrick wanted his name off the credit. It says Dalton Trumbo's the writer, but he was a blacklisted writer by Elia Kazan and Walt Disney and all those guys that blacklisted all those ex-commies by getting them all to admit they were commies at one time, sending them to jail, firing them. They were on strike anyway, who knows. The blacklist got really hard. It was right around the antitrust decision around Paramount that the blacklist was going on. So now the studios couldn't block books, so their writers were getting gangplanked. Anyway, Dalton Trumbo, who is from my hometown of Grand Junction, and besides me and about 5 other guys that live in this town and are making movies too, there's not really much cinema that happens here, although the 5 of us got it under control, right guys? I could even say their names. There's like Todd Braley, Seth Schaefer, and frickin' Arden McConnell, Dylan Hardy. They're all hard workers. Dylan's my cousin. I don't claim to be above them or around them as much as I need to be, but they've all came to the rescue on some of my films, and so I've come to the rescue and fulfilled teacherly positions so that Grand Junction would have on the map a teacherly position that I can grant through my PhD. And I didn't talk so much about this, my dear class, about my Pulitzer Prize or my other precious awards that are just so overwhelmingly overbearing emotionally to just sit back and stare at my awards. But we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. We're going to talk about Modesty Blaze. And I like the fact that Spartacus is a great movie, one of the best, even if you count it as Kubrick or not, which I don't know if he wants me to or not anymore now that he's dead, but I kind of do because it's still on the titles. But how Dalton Trumbo got in the titles and Joseph Losey, the reason I bring all that up is because he is, yes, directed by Joseph Losey. That's good, because for a minute I was thinking, is this one of those And God Created Women movies by like Roger Vadim, who went on to make Barbarella? And that's what this is kind of like, because like the Modesty Blaze is, I swear, a formula for the Mod Squad to look like this. And Blaze is the type of leather she's got on, or is the type of gun. And that Modesty likes to blaze is true, because she'll smoke one up and she'll smoke a gun at you, and then you can see a tattoo on her. And that this is basically now that there were these films in the 1950s, while the Blacklist was kind of airing down, and in the 60s, later in the 50s and the 60s, and one was called The Deceivers, and actually Sharon Tate's in it, and it's got the guy from Rio Bravo, Dean Martin. Sorry, that shouldn't have skipped my mind, especially when I'm doing a Scorsese segment, okay? Don't tell Scorsese I almost spaced Dean Martin. But Dean Martin's in The Deceivers as Matt Helm, this like James Bond spoof. And James Bond, we all know, comes from the Hitchcock motivation of writing. Like, not quite a peak roll, but like more of a North by Northwest, so it is peak roll. It's like you take a 39 Steps and you can turn it into a Bond. You take a Hitchcock movie like Secret Agent, you can turn it into a Bond. I mean, that Bond ideas where he was like the secret agent that dies supposedly and comes back to life, that's totally Alfred Hitchcock. That the North by Northwest series was a total predecessor to Dr. No. Doesn't even help when you look at the crop duster scene versus the helicopter shooting in Dr. No, and you kind of look at these scenes like they're the same. But between them all, there were these sandwiched heroes of pop culture movies that like really now we all associate with the B-movie parody, you know, Austin Powers. And I'm not saying the Austin Powers movies aren't kind of funny. They're not as lasting as these In Like Flint, Modesty Blaze movies. Not just saying they're too new, but that these Modesty Blaze movies have gone through it all, even a blasting by Austin Powers, and still look great and still are funny and still kick ass, adds to the fact that the whole Bond genre started with Casino Royale, not the one with Daniel Craig that came out in the 2000s. I'm talking about Casino Royale by John Huston and all the other directors that directed part of it, with everybody from Woody Allen to Peter Sellers as James Bond. And that's how the mod style of new era America came in, that sort of chic that enters with the Pink Panther by Blake Edwards. This sort of chic that makes the design look oh so suave and oh so sexually, but in a kind of romantic comedy, kind of screwball funny way. And in screwball comedy, there's allowed to be clutches that are romantic, like Pink Panther, but there are also allowed to be supermodel chicks that have nothing better to do on their mind but be a secret agent. Even in a film which is style over the substance, Losey's showing off that he can still make Hollywood in England, even being blacklisted sort of, now that the blacklist is over, but he's got Monica Vitti, and we all know, and Terrence Stamp, of course, makes his wonderful appearance as the latently appreciative Q that gives her weapons and stuff, and is kind of her boyfriend too. And Terrence Stamp, Monica Vitti, do they get together in this film? Probably not enough, but yeah. And then does Monica Vitti show off for all her beauty? Yes. And now there's that film Law Ventura. I gotta say this in conclusion because we're about to wrap up tonight's YouTube masterclass, but there's a movie, and we'll come in more with next week. We only got through 3 films. We got dozens and dozens of more boxes to go through before we're anywhere near the history of cinema that we'd have to go back and put through in order, which is why I skip around, because I don't necessarily want someone to follow me from the beginning and go all the way to the end, because then we'd be stuck in the silent era somewhere by the 6th term and wouldn't know enough about future terms, so we skip around and look at them accordingly. But that Modesty Blaise, again, in her type of Casino Royale, new wave, even as it faces with the challenges of today's postmodern parodies, it ends up being sexy in a way that the movie La Ventura fails us from VT's sexuality. Because in VT's sexuality, we're taking more of the Laura Mulvey camp that VT is like this object. That like she's an object and we're just going to stare at her and she can't be subject. In Modesty Blaise, she's the subject. In La Ventura, everybody's looking at her, she's walking around, whoosh, she's gone. The obscure object of desire is now obscured. She's gone. She's not in the film anymore. In La Ventura by Michelangelo Antonioni, the great Antonioni of La Notte and The Passenger, he's all together there and he's saying Monica Vitti didn't make it to the end of this film. Whether that was in cutting or her leaving or just the way they shot it, who cares? It's how it turned out. Nobody really intended it or said they did, and nobody admitted to it, but loved that it went that way. In Modesty Blaise, she does not disappear. That there's a few scenes of the camera trucking outside of a building in the title sequence. Don't let that fool you. It's just trying to show you how big these high-rises are, that all these interesting things are happening against us. Now we have industry booming to the city, and who better but the swanky cedary Modesty Blaise. And of course that she's a James Bond type and from Britain doesn't bother any of us Americans, that most of the Bond films were funded in America, were an MGM creation, but were shot sometimes in Great Britain, especially made to seem like British movies, and that they're more like co-productions, and that the British claim production over, say, like this film, Performance, and totally for a reason why they should claim, and we'll talk more about Performance soon, but we have a little bit, but how they would claim production of a movie like this when it's obviously British. But Joseph Losey, being American, is now working with an American studio to see which Performance will get sold to Warner, eventually the film itself, and sold out to Warner, still a British movie. But that Modesty Blaise is by Joseph Losey, he's only British because he went there in the early days after leaving every other European country where he couldn't make films, not because he did anything bad, but because the Americans had put him on the spot for an early blacklist for one reason, and he chose to bail out of America long before he could. But then he'd turn around and make this movie like Eve in the early days of the British movement of Joseph Losey in the 50s, and you're thinking he's advanced in his ways like Louis Malle or Kenneth Anger, pre-New Wave and post-No Wave survivors in France, that French New Wave. But that Joseph Losey is making a New Wave kind of film for the whole pop culture crowd is just his way of saying he can still control a movie, even if it goes like Eve into obscurity, and where the La Ventura, what happened to this character when, and where my Shadow's character is going, and who's making casting Shadow. With the Modesty Blaise, she's so hip she could kick Austin Powers' ass, and that's true. She could. He'd melt into, he wouldn't know how to deal with a woman like that. That she's in the lead as the woman is what I'm trying to say. That she's the subject, even though we want her to kind of be the object. It's only the men trapping her that want her to be the object, that she's the toy-like female object. Every other time she's calling the shots. And if Terrence Stamp doesn't do exactly everything Modesty Blaise tells her to do, then he just ain't cool and he just ain't hip. And in Fritz the Cat words, if you ain't cool and you ain't hip, then you ain't going to head outside with me right after class and smoke some weed recreationally in the state of Colorado. But I sent this to Harvard, and I'm sorry for cussing at that one point about that Scorsese quote. And we'll try to limit the cussing for COURSERA, that you have to pay to COURSERA for the proof that you've seen this class is up to them, and that you take the final at the end as the only other requirement. That I may require a little bit of book reading, although I do recommend Laura Mulvey on Citizen Kane, the BFI classic book, because for now that's where you could get the start of her subject-object theory, which is also pretty much the name of that article, Ideology, Subject and Object as Appearance in American Film by Laura Mulvey. And that's her great article. So I'm going to assign those. Whether you read them or not, it's on your own consciousness, but if you quote them at all, I'll give you a hint for the final. This is only hour 2. We're going to hour 3 next. We're going to describe some more films, maybe in a genre. We'll get caught up to where you need to be this semester. And we hope that the animation beginning of all this kind of gave you some hope on what you'd get to hear in the class. And we thank you for attending Masterclass tonight. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your holiday. And we'll be back a couple more times before holiday break is really setting into next semester. And we're going to go through the semester, and it'll look like we're going to teach I'm going to be teaching this class till March, it looks like. So hang on to your butts, because we're going to be going through a lot of movies fast and barely getting through any slow. So time flies slow when you're here. All right, thanks guys for another good YouTube masterclass. COURSERA, Harvard, USC, CALARTS, thank you. We'll talk to you all later. Thank you, my friends and lovers. You're great. All right, and cut.